I think the intent is noble, even though the execution is not necessarily as seamless. If we get it right, hopefully it might improve things. I think the hope of everyone is everybody gets to a stage where we can all be in band A. Everybody gets to a stage where we can all have 24 hours of power, and then nobody is worried about the money that you're paying, because in reality, more power that we have, the more we're able to do a lot more useful things for our society.
Source for better ways of generating revenue. The House of Representatives is yet to approve this request.
Introducing the Big Issue Show. Power is a big issue, especially over the past few weeks where it's become an even bigger issue, and this is irrespective of where you fall into, bands A, B, C, or even abandoned. Now, this is a lot more tragic than the humor seeks to convey, because can you be Nigerian without having worried about power, irrespective of your generation? Well, let's explore all of our issues around power generation, transmission, distribution. That is our big issue for today. All of this in a bit. Hello, my name is Buchi Onyegbule, and I'm very glad to welcome you to this edition of The Big Issue. The Big Issue is that big issue show where we engage on all of the serious matters that affect all and sundry across the 36 states of the Federation and, of course, the FCT. Today, I am joined by my very good friend, Mohammed Mijindadi, who is the president of GE Vernova for Nigeria. Welcome, Mo.
Pleasure to be here, Buchi.
We're going to talk about something that you've known from when you were basically a kid, and I don't know if it's 70 years later, and while we're facing the same issues now. But just to establish our bona fides for our listeners, for our watchers, as to why you are the right person to talk to about this. You do work in the energy sector.
Yes, very much so. So I work for a company, General Electric, GE Vernova, and we are an equipment manufacturer in the power generation space. We manufacture turbines, both on the thermal side with gas turbines. We manufacture turbines on the hydro side. We're involved in wind, we're involved in electrification and the supporting auxiliaries to bring power to the everyday need. So yes, I would like to believe with my experience and the background of the company that I'm affiliated with, I do have a thing or two to say.
Okay, I like the fact that we've both established that bona fide. Now, let's start now with generation. Minister after minister, administration after administration, democratic dispensation, military dispensation, we're still struggling with power generation. We currently generate about 5,000 megawatts of power, and that's been there for years. In comparison, we have a much larger population than, say, South Africa, for example, which generates nearly 10 times more than we do. So why is it? What are the issues with generating power that's, just sort of hung us in the neck, for this long? Nigeria has the largest number of people without access to electricity globally. And it seems like we keep ticking these boxes of, poverty capital of the world. Like everything that could be negative, we tick these boxes. So what is our issue with generation? Let's start with generation.
So I think it's a great question, but for us to properly appreciate the context, I think it's important to set a bit of a foundation on just how power gets to us. So I like to use the notion of a value chain. It's very simple for us in our homes. We put on a switch and power comes, but there are several steps that go through before that power gets to you. I always like to say, in at least my view, and depending on who you talk to, they start the value chain from different places. I like to start the value chain from the fuel that brings power to you. It could either be gasoline, it could be diesel, it could be natural gas. The fuel is actually where it starts. So from fuel, you move fuel to a generating plant. And think about a generating plant just the way you have a generator at home. In your homes, you could probably have a small 15 kilowatt or 150 kilowatt. A generating station is multiple times of that. So again, the bigger the generating plant, the more homes you're able to cover. Now you need gasoline or a fuel that feeds this generating plant. It's a separate person that runs the gas companies. It's a separate person that owns these generating plants. From the generating plants, you get into the transmission network. Now everybody talks about TCN, but pretty much the transmission network comprises of substations that either step up the power from the generating plants, moves it through transmission lines to a distribution point, and it steps it down. So you might hear people say, oh, step up, step down, transformer and transmission. That entire conveyor belt is the transmission network. Then we get to the distribution.
Yeah.
And distribution is actually the area a lot of people are familiar with power. You know, you either complain about AEDC, back in the day it was NEPA, and a lot of people can relate to those because that's who is the custodian of the power as they know it.
Basically last mile.
Well, it's really, you could call it the last mile, and they're responsible for moving this power from the basics, the substations, into your homes. So for power to work in the way that we expect it to work, you must have everything across this value chain working in symmetry. It's not exactly the easiest thing to do, especially when it's not the same person who is incentivized the same way in each of these segments. And I think in a nutshell, that really is what the problem we've been facing. I wouldn't call it a generation issue. I think it's a systemic issue across the value chain.
Thank you. So let's then pick the first part of the value chain. You did talk about generation and how gas, you know, plays a huge part there. You know, Nigeria, we have low gas supply, which is also a problem with the generation. We have the 9th largest gas reserves, and I'm pretty sure you're going to give us some a bit more clarity as to what the issues are. Yet our production is, you know, only about 1%. So what is the limitation that we have that's making us produce less than we need?
Yeah. So remember I told you about the first point on the value chain, which is really the molecules.
Yeah.
You are right. We are a gas producing country. However, we haven't invested as much in the gas space as we have in, say, crude oil. And there's several reasons for that. You could say because crude is maybe the most talked about resource that we have, at the expense of gas, you have a lot of exploration companies that would rather burn off this crude in the context of flare gas, because what they've been able to understand they can monetize today is crude oil. I think there needs to be better education from the government. There's a lot of policies that are being put in place, not just locally, but also internationally, that has tried to incentivize commercialization of gas. I think once you're able to allow field owners to understand that, look, as much as you think crude is lucrative, you could also find lucrative means in gas, a lot more investment will go in that space. Now, when you have the investment, you have a lot more gas. If you have a lot more gas, a lot more power plants can run. There are other areas that I think are a bit of a hindrance. You know, there's the issue of vandalization that we have. You know, most of the gas that we have in Nigeria is located in the south-south region. Politically or non-political reasons, there's a lot of, you know, unstableness in that region. Sometimes that also affects the ability. But I think when we pick generation in context now, you know, I've given you some things that feed into the generation aspect of it. I think there are a lot of investments that need to go in that space that haven't been done to the scale that it needs to be done. And the reason why it has not been done, like I said, is because several players are incentivized separately. Until we get the right level of investment in the space, I think you're still going to have a bit of this mismatch.
When you say several players are incentivized, you know, separately, how exactly do you mean?
So remember I gave you the story about a value chain.
Yeah.
So if myself as the gas provider who needs to give Buchi Generation Company, I'll say maybe 100 scoffs of gas.
Yeah.
If I know that I can take my gas outside and get better pricing for it, I don't have as much of an incentive to send gas to you.
me.
Now, what the government has tried to do is the government has tried to create some sort of a domesticated gas price that says for everyone who has gas, please provide local players gas at this price. The pricing for domestic gas is not necessarily tallying with the prices that they would be able to command externally.
Internationally.
So if I was running a business, what will be most important for me is where can I get the best return for my investment? And it's not necessarily always local. So those are some of the incentives that I'm saying.
So who makes up the shortfall? And does it amount to that word that has sort of come to live in our consciousness, the subsidy? Is that a subsidy? Or is the government basically making this gas generation?
I think where the government is involved, you can consider it a subsidy. Where the government is not involved, then literally gas generating companies will have to, they call it like willing buyer, willing seller, which means you have to go out there and negotiate and get your pricing. But the power industry is not, I wouldn't say it is completely free of subsidy. I think the government, because power also is a social infrastructure, the government tries to ensure that there is a bit of regulation and balance in such a way that it's not run 100% like a business. Because if it is, everybody who is not willing to pay a band A price will definitely not be getting power.
We'll come back to that because we'll talk about the prices that we're paying at the end as the end users, and also look at the fact that perhaps there's actually no country in the world where power prices are not being set by the government, which is very interesting when you hear the arguments being made for the increase of the tariff, especially for band A customers. But let's talk transmission.
Yes.
Right. So let's imagine that for some reason we're able to slay all the demons of generation, and we're able to say generate 7,500, right?
Yeah.
Can we transmit that today?
Today, I think, let me say, historically, we've not been in a position to do it, and that has been the biggest bottleneck. I think there has been a lot of interest in the generation space, interest in the context of not just focus, but also when they started privatizing assets. The government realized it was in a position where it wasn't in the best place to run generating assets. And they put out notices, they got a few private individuals to come in, but the government held on to the transmission space. Now, what that led basically was a lack of investment also in the transmission space, in such a way that you have this huge transmission capability, but not at par ability to wield the power, which is where you're coming today to say we can probably only do. You could, depending on who you talk to, it's between 5,000, they'll tell you 7,000. At sometimes they try to make it seem like 10,000. So we don't have the transmission network today that is able to take all the power that we're able to generate. Reason being, investments have not been made at par. So there are lots of other issues. Investment is the most important one. The second one also is our transmission network is a complete national network. So what that means is the ability to lose power is there because you have a very long stretch to be able to take the power all over the place. So there's a lot of losses that come from that. In recent times, there's been an increase in vandalization. I've heard of at least 2 or 3 substations that have been blown up by insurgents and stuff like that. So I think this lack of investment and the wide scale of transmission have made it very, very difficult. Also, I don't know if we're going to get to it, but in recent times, I think obviously maybe like within the last 7 days, there's been a new announcement in the transmission space.
About the unbundling of the sector.
About the unbundling. I think government is trying to find the most effective way to be able to manage it. I think my answer to your question directly is there has not been a commensurate investment in the transmission space to be able to close the gap.
And do you think that the unbundling that that the government has said they're going to do into a company that's now limited by shares,
yes,
basically now a private company where you can buy into, is that going to improve the?
It's a trick question, and I think the proof will be in the pudding, let me put it that way. And I say that because, so this new company, it's supposed to be an independent system operator.
Supposedly.
Supposedly. And what that means is basically when it comes to marketing the power, when it comes to trying to make sure you're at the right price points, they figured rather than putting everything under TCN, let's separate it, let TCN focus on building the network and let somebody else focus on operating it. Now you could ask whether creating a new entity is the solution for that, or wasn't there already a department within TCN that was doing this, and is it a matter of just managing the structure a bit better? It's questionable, to be honest with you. I think in my view, if it helps to make the system run more effectively, I'll be all for it, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, because I'm curious as to, because this distinction that you've made in terms of, okay, TCN handled the infrastructure, the new entity handled the operations, but you've just made the case that part of the issue that we have, in fact, a major part of the issue that we have with transmission is a lack of investment in the infrastructure.
Correct.
So if the TCN is still holding on to being responsible for the infrastructure, that doesn't solve that problem with investment, does it? How does it still attract it?
I think this announcement is probably one of several that have to go with the cleanup. And again, to be fair to the government, I think everyone is looking for the best solution to come out with it. I think this is one step. There have been several conversations also around, just like what I mentioned about the transmission network being too wide. I'm of the opinion, obviously, we need to find ways of ring fencing the transmission network. I mean, you can call them, maybe focus on geopolitical zones. You could say focus on maybe smaller segments. And what that does, it makes it a lot easier to be able to ring fence a particular area. That says if we co-locate generation, transmission, distribution, it makes it a bit easier to ensure the customers are being able to get the service. If there are problems, you're able to quickly troubleshoot. I think the size of the network today in the national context is a little too much to be able to do. We're doing too many things with an aged network, and it might not be as easy to scale up in that context. So there are several things.
And this is where the national grid conversation comes in,
Correct.
isn't it? Because I mean, if we're dependent on one grid, or you know, if when you give clarity on one system that supplies us power or
Yes.
transmits power to us, which means if there is a fault maybe in the northeast, it's
Correct.
very likely that it could affect us, you know, in Abuja or even down
Correct.
south.
So we've been having all these, everyone calls them grid collapses, you know, so that's been something that's happened at least a few times and stuff, but it's very similar. It could be possible that the fault of some of these collapses may not be local. They may be from several states away. But again, either an oversurge or an undersurge, something trips and, you know, everybody kind of goes down for it.
Interesting you use the word trip,
Yeah.
because when people hear national grid collapsing, often they think, you know, there's this huge system or systems or structure that just, you know, basically falls down, you know, like a rig that, you know, there's an explosion or something and it goes down. But I've seen people say that it's basically not much different from a circuit breaker in your house tripping off.
It's the right. So remember how I started with the analogy for you about thinking about the generating plant being like your generator?
Yeah.
Think about the transmission system, like the wires that goes from your control generating set all through the house. If you have a surge in power, you have a trip, and more than likely it's the control switch. So that's the way it is when your grid trips. So if you think about power in the context of how you manage your home, just think about it in a much larger scale, and that gives you a bit of an inkling on what we're talking about in the industry.
So, you know, basically like in my house, for example, a few times I found that, you know, maybe I had wires that were not maybe strong enough, and then you turn on an air conditioner or a deep freezer, or maybe you turn on too many appliances at once,
then it trips.
And it trips off and you lose power.
And I'm sure your kids don't go, or your family members don't go around chasing you for your head when that happens.
But then that's basically what it looks like when we say the national grid collapses.
It's very similar.
So we could actually use the headline, National Grid trips off. But
Yes.
it doesn't particularly
It doesn't have the sensational push to it.
Yeah, but also, I mean, if an entire nation is going without power, then you using trip off, it doesn't give you the... Okay, let's talk about the discos now,
Yes.
right? This is the part of the value chain that I deal with.
Everybody.
I'm never going to, unless I begin to work in the sector or maybe have someone in the sector here, I'm never going to find myself talking with someone from the GenCos or from TCN or from the new entity that's being created. I have no business with them as a consumer of power, right? So the discos are the people that I interface with on a daily basis.
Yes.
ADC are the people that I basically curse out in my mind when I don't have power. So where do they come in here?
Yeah.
You know, what are their limitations? How do you... I don't want to go too subjectively to ask you if they've played their part.
Yeah.
So I just want to ask, why do you think they're not able to give us the power that we need, right? Yeah. And are there instances where there's maybe a bit more power that's available that they are able to distribute to us?
It's very true. And again, I'm trying to make sure I don't go with the cliche of lack of investment. But the disco is, in my view, one of the most important pieces on this value chain, because they're not only the last mile in the term that you use, but they're also responsible for the lifeline. And I say that because they're the ones who get the money. And the money that they get in the form of the tariff that you pay is what trickles all the way back through that same value chain, and then everybody gets paid. So what that means is if you and I do not pay the discos, if you and I go and bypass meters, it means for all the power that has been invested by the generating companies, the gas that they have taken, the cost to do the transmission infrastructure, nobody is able to get paid. And this is where the problem comes, where a lot of people have been arguing about cost-reflective tariffs. Now, the discos, for the most part, is made up of private sector players. I think there are still a few discos that are government-owned. If you remember what I said, Power back in the day was fully a social service that was run by the government. So there are not a lot of, we have what we call like power purchase agreements in recent times today, which basically is an agreement with people that, look, you know what, if you build and generate power, you will be paid for it. Back in the day when it was a social service, it was just free. When you bring private investors into a space, everybody needs to get paid. So what you have now where discos are privatized, they're trying to run these things as a business. So they cannot afford to have people utilizing power, leaving your homes with your ACs on and all of those things, because it's not a social service. It is a commercial cost, and every megawatt that is consumed has to be paid for. So what the frustration that we feel, I think, is the lack of parity between the service that the discos are providing and the perceived service that the consumers are receiving from it. People feel they're paying too much and not getting enough. People feel they're willing to pay more, but they cannot get enough. And in the context of the way the power is run today, there is a central person who aggregates the power and they decide how to spread it around. So for Abuja, for instance, Abuja is sharing the same distribution company with, Abuja as a city is being given power by AEDC. It's the same with Nasarawa. I think there's some aspects of Niger State. They're all of these places. So when AEDC gets the power, they have to decide how to split it to all the cities that they're giving. If you run a business, what would be the formula that you would use?
Pareto principle is that, where am I getting the most money?
Exactly. So this now goes back to this question, which you haven't come to, and I'm sure you're getting to, which is, how do you prioritize where to put the power? You probably push it to where you think people are paying. And where people are paying, you want to try and maximize it the most, because where people aren't paying, you need money to basically push it through. So that's just a nutshell of what happens in the distribution space. And I think there's been a lot of disparity between discos feeling they're not getting the true cost of the power that they're pushing that allows them to run an efficient business.
But in many cases, too, this also calls to question the efficacy of the discos. When I moved into my apartment, I was the one who kept chasing and chasing. I paid for the meters, which I don't think that I should have initially. I paid for the meters and chased the AEDC for weeks. And as then, thankfully, I hadn't needed to move in. But I chased the AEDC for weeks before I could get the meters installed. I chased them to do it. So if I had gone in, and it's a gated estate, if I had gone in and I'd moved in, it'd probably not be so easy for them to actually get in and find out. So it could have been really easy for me to get a connection from somewhere, bypass, and keep using power without paying them. So the efficacy of the discos is also called into question, because I'm pretty sure that I'm not the only person who has this lamentation about it.
I would not taking brief for the discos, but I would also, I'm sure that depending on what disco you go to, a lot of these bureaucratic issues that you're describing, I wouldn't say they're driven by the leadership of these companies. I think you're dealing with companies that were public service companies before, where people have gotten used to operating a certain type of way, where people know that for anywhere that you have gaps is an opportunity for people to make money. So people have built systems that they sustain themselves off these irregularities. I don't believe as business owners, I'm not saying that there aren't business owners who are also looking to cut corners. I think most business owners would like to have improvements in the facilities they have in place to track what is going, if they feel they can be paid. I think a lot of the bottlenecks comes from bureaucracy and either people circum-guessing the system, I would hate to think it's a deliberate effort from...
Okay, just as you're not trying to hold brief for them, I'm also not trying to put them too much on blast. So let's talk about the cost reflective tariff.
Correct.
I mean, because you refer to it as, because you painted the picture of the discos being responsible for taking the finances, the money that should go back into the system so that people can get paid, right? And the entire question has been there about, tariffs not particularly being cost reflective. Correct. Until this recent increase, which is supposed to affect 15% of the paying consumers. Nigeria paid one of the cheapest power bills in the world. Probably only, I think we paid higher than only Iran and maybe 3 or 4 other countries up until a few months ago, right? Or a few weeks ago. And even with this increment that affects 15% of the consumers, we still pay one of the lowest power bills, even on the continent. And so the question now is, how hard or how easy will it be to sell the idea of, power is expensive. If you must get better power, you have to pay for it.
Yeah.
How it's not going to be easy to sell that to the average Nigerian who barely even sees the power.
Yeah.
And so it's basically like a chicken and an egg situation.
Correct.
You know that you need the money to come back into the value chain in order for the power to become a lot more consistent.
Yeah.
But then you also need the trust
Yeah.
of those that you want to give a cost-reflective tariff. So how do you strike that balance?
It's a double-edged sword, and I know you called it the chicken and the egg, but the way I'd like to correct a notion. In my view, I actually don't believe people would object to paying a premium if they're certain that they will get that power. Remember today, a lot of people were probably spending a lot more self-generating. If you have to buy diesel, if you have to buy petrol, in addition to what it is that you're doing with regards to your regular credit that you're putting for your tariff, I think people spend on the average a lot more than they would if everybody was even on this band A. The problem, like you've talked around, is around this trust, and it's saying, even though I'm willing to pay this premium, can this power be provided to me? And this is where I think the tricky situation is, because in my view, even if the discos have the best intentions, because I have mentioned the steps that go before them, I'm not sure if they have total control to be able to do it, which is why, in my view, if you reduced the coverage area, I think it makes it a bit easier for discos to be able to promise to give you 20 hours and 30 hours, because it's a smaller zone that they have to cater for compared to what it is today in this bigger sense.
Yeah, but if you reduce, if AEDC has 3-4 cities and you say, okay, yeah, we're going to reduce it, you have 1 or 2, they can now promise us better power, right? But the problem with that is they have to promise us power that has already been generated and transmitted to them.
Yes.
So if you do not have that capacity to transmit more to them, then even if you bring another one, say UEDC, that comes in to take the other one, you're still going to split that power that AEDC had
So my
before.
concept of a smaller structure would be trying to put a generating station, a dedicated transmission and distribution that you can ring fence.
I see.
So that way, I'm servicing 3 million people. I have a dedicated 100 megawatts or 200 megawatts that is for these people. This is where the gas is coming and feeding here. This is the network that connects these people. This is who is distributing and collecting the money. So it makes it a bit easier to even make a business case to say, look, I can effectively be sure that, look, this is how it's distributed. This is my idea of what I think will be an ideal situation.
Rather than one huge, unwieldy ecosystem, you have multiple ecosystems that have all the value chains in their smaller area.
I think in a perfect world, that is what I think would be ideal, in a perfect world, because we're so far away from being able to build enough generation and distribute enough generation to feed everybody. There's just so much of a need. So for the next few years to come, we're still going to find a situation where the discos are going to have very limited power and have to choose what is the most effective way to distribute this, that they can generate money.
Okay. I think we'll take this one now because I think you've made this.
But let's talk
really
about the issue about this tariff that you were discussing and everything, So the question of tariff, I think, again, it's a context where the players are trying to find what the optimal pricing is. Yeah. And I think, again, it's the sector trying to find where the even balance is. They've been accused a lot, and when I say they, I mean like the regulators have been accused a lot from both ends, I guess, both from the consumers and then the providers, that there isn't a cost-reflective tariff. At least the providers are saying that. So I think what the regulators are trying to do is find a way in such that even if you're going to segment and pick who you give the power, if it's a few people who have the ability to do it, put a price point that at least makes up for the losses that you don't have. And I think that's where all of these banding comes in. Even before the banding, I think they've always had, like they call them different R1, R2, different tiers. They looked for different ways to do it. And I think this is also an attempt to just try to find what it is. If it works in the way it's supposed to work, it might be a good way to segment the market. But as you can see, there's been several adjustments. Firstly, by trying to put everybody on band A when not everybody was receiving 20 hours plus.
That was a bit underhand. Well,
again, like I told you, when it comes to the bureaucracy, everybody is going to try their luck. So again, it might have been a mistake, it might have been deliberate. At the end of the day, it was adjusted. I think the other thing that happened recently, which is again quite commendable, is an adjustment on the tariff price. Initially Band A was 225 naira, and then it got reduced to, I think, 206. And the reason was, well, because you claim that there are several elements that goes into the costing, where the FX also needs to be accounted for, where there's a positive gain on the naira, it also needs to be accounted for. So I think the intent is noble, even though the execution is not necessarily as seamless. If we get it right, hopefully it might improve things. I think the hope of everyone is everybody gets to a stage where we can all be in Band A. Everybody gets to a stage where we can all have 24 hours of power, and then nobody is worried about the money that you're paying, because in reality, more power that we have, the more we're able to do a lot more useful things for our society. We can industrialize, we can open our shops 24 hours. I think it just has a completely radical effect on what it could do for the economy, which it goes beyond the pain that we're discussing.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you. I'm a very big fan of fairness, right? I was probably one of the least complainants of the tariff increase, because I am in Band A, right? But I know that I've had, unless there's maybe one huge issue with the lines or something, I have had the power that they promised for Band A. So I cannot particularly complain. But the part of me still winces when I'm paying for that power. So to sort of bring this conversation to a bit of a close, let's talk about the ways that we can bypass some of the issues that we have with generation, right? Because when you talked about the value chain, before starting with generation, you talked about the gas,
the fuel,
the fuel, and I know that I keep picking on South Africa, but largely because it's one of the few African countries that I've stayed in before the past 4 years, where you've seen steady power. 85% of their power is coal.
Yes.
Not as much dependence on oil or gas like we are, right? But I also know that today there's the whole conversation about renewable energy, energy that is clean, which is a very interesting word to define energy, right? Are there options for Nigeria to tap into that can help us bridge our gap in terms of being able to generate power that's maybe not necessarily out of the grid, but sort of like a complement to the grid?
Yeah, so I think you touch on a very important topic, and this energy transition, decarbonization, over the last few years, it's taking a life of its own, and for several reasons. I think there are the positive aspects of the conversation, which have to do with real, natural climate issues that we're dealing with. And it's ironic that we talk about it in the context that we do, but even just around us, if you think about the heat wave we've been going through this year, it's astonishing. If you look at pictures in Dubai that has had, unexplainable rainfall and floods, if you think about droughts in other parts of the world,
Nairobi is currently suffering a huge rainfall.
Everywhere. So you see, the context of climate change, I think, is real. And when it comes to what we can be doing differently, I think there's a positive side of it. But then there's the other side of it, which is more around the energy security side of things. And I think we saw the first step of people having to really put their foot where their mouth is during the last COP27 or something like that, where there is a war in Russia. Russia has been supplying gas to most of Europe and basically managing the gas prices. And with this war, there was a cut in that gas. And many countries who had been at the forefront of pushing decarbonization had to stand to say, okay, in the absence of power, what then are you going to do? And we had a lot of them running back to things that they had left behind. You heard Germany, who had shut down power plants, coal plants, running back to kind of get them reignited and stuff like that, Well. So I think the truth is we need to find a balance. You talked about South Africa. South Africa, yes, they have about 40 gigawatts of power, predominantly coal. But when everybody was on this bandwagon, they slowed down and stopped investing in new power plants. They said they were not doing coal anymore. They were not going to finance anything coal, and they were looking for new sources. If you go to South Africa now, they're having power shortages because they've stopped investing over time, hoping that they were catching on to this big bandwagon. And now that everyone is backtracked, they find out that they have a big backlog.
It's not power cuts, though. It's load shedding.
Well, it's a fancy way of saying
it's load shedding, not power cuts.
So what do we need to be doing? I think there are a few things that we need to be doing on our end.
Yeah.
Most importantly, you need to balance the availability of power with the security of power, because you're not going to have a perfect mix. With the availability thing, I think there's a lot more we can be doing to diversify our energy mix.
Yeah.
As it is today, a lot of the power that we have on the grid is from gas and hydro.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of efforts that people have been doing focused on the solar side of things. You know, I think solar is going to be the future. It's not, I think this is without a doubt.
It's a done deal.
Wind is a big thing. It's not big in Nigeria, but again, off the coast shores, there are arguments to be made to be able to build extra wind farms, you know. So there's a lot more we can do to diversify the mix. That means that we're not solely focused on just one source of energy. Now, when you think about decarbonization in the Nigerian context, I think there's several things that we can do. First of all, we're not even optimizing the assets that we have today. You know, I was telling you that if we are able to take half the generating sets that people use in their homes, the amount of greenhouse emissions that will be reduced will be significant. And what is the solution to do that? Make sure that we have an alternative where people can come to. You know, there are arguments around, like I said, putting in renewable energy into the mix of what we have. There are new forms of energy. You know, people are talking about hydrogen. My company has technology that burns hydrogen. And this is hydrogen that you can either get from the atmosphere, is hydrogen that you can create. So there's the new age of energy that we need to be able to build to, but I think we're not there yet. I think what we should focus on as a country right now is optimizing the assets that we have, find a way of cleaning what it is that is in existence, and then we can think about going through a longer term transition into clean energy in the context that is described today.
All right, thank you. And I absolutely agree in terms of, you know, looking at what, especially that solar is the in thing. Because I remember that over the festive period, we were struggling with power for our parents' home, and immediately we actually then went ahead, bit the bullet, and bought a few solar panels for them. Then all of that sort of became a thing of the past, and it's an expensive outlay initially, but it looks like, you know, it's something that will. Yeah. So let's also you talked about optimizing the assets that we have.
Correct.
Right. And so I'm thinking about it, not necessarily in terms of the infrastructure that we have and making it work for us, but I'm also thinking about it in terms of pairing that power with, or the power generation, whether it's on grid or off grid, with our economic zones that can, because you talked about one of the biggest aims, which is, you know, industrialization.
Correct.
And this is where I'm now thinking about our special, or maybe not so special, but economic zones, economic powerhouses and hubs. How can we, what are the quickest ways that we can get them, you know,
up and running?
Yes.
Yes. So remember when I keep talking about this whole ring fence?
Yeah.
I think a perfect example of this ring fence would be the geometric project in Aba.
Yeah.
You know, Aba is, you could call it the industrial capital of Nigeria. I wouldn't say it's the most populated, but that's where the heart of manufacturing comes from, you know, just basic textile, everyday goods and stuff like that. Geometric Power, which is a company that we had the opportunity of providing turbines for, they created a power plant over there in Aba, where they built the power plant, they built the distribution network to supply the people in Aba, and they made it sort of a ring fence. Now, what they're trying to do basically is provide 24 hours of power for the people within the Aba community. And for me, that is an example of the right sort of model that can work for this sort of economic zones, because it's guaranteed power that is basically embedded in a certain ring-fenced area. You're not worried about, you know, too much power going everywhere else. It's just within this group. People who are willing to pay the price are able to get the power that they need, and it's a small area that allows the owners of this asset provide optimal service. Now imagine what can come out of an Aba that basically has 24 hours of electricity. You have people who have factories that are working around the clock. You know, I mean, people in Aba have been so revolutionary even without the power in historically. So today, where you're able to provide power, I think it just basically surges the revolutionization of the industries that we're talking about. And imagine if you can have pockets of these across several places, either in commercial zones, in residential zones. I mean, for me, that's really the power of how we feel we will be able to provide the best optimal use, you know, to be able to industrialize the country. So geometric is a great example of nice concept, great area, and we're all rooting to see that it works the way that it was modeled to, because it will change the way industrialization works in the power space.
Thank you. Because I'm now thinking about replicating same in maybe even if it's 6 different industrial zones, so maybe Agbara, Ido,
Yep.
take it into Kano with leather and textile and all of that, and we can immediately see what I think that we will immediately see the benefits. But what is the end game? Because you talked about the importance of the power going out and the finances coming back in.
Yes.
That's an example of investment, right?
Yes.
And where it's expected to come out. It's private sector driven.
Mostly. It has to be private sector. Well, again, I think it's a mix. So I think there are roles for everyone to play. I think the government has a role with regards to, as a regulator, to regulate, make sure the environment is conducive for attracting investment and ensuring that investment thrives. And the private sector has a role to play with regards to pushing the right level of investment and staying long-term enough to be able to have those investments change the lives of people. The end game that you said is we're a country of 200 million people, where basically a fraction of people have access to power. How can you get a lot more people having power than people who don't? And that's really where it's all about.
And hopefully we will answer that question, because I don't have kids yet, but I'm really, really hoping that I do not, have my kids grow into adulthood still thinking about, and having conversations around power and power generation and transmission and thinking about 5,000 or 6,000 or 7,000. I would really, really hope that they don't.
Hopefully not.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for coming on the show
me
today. It's been really, really great talking to you.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Right, you've been watching The Big Issue. My name is Buchi Onyegbule. This is that show where we examine big ticket matters that affects everyone across the 36 states of the Federation and, of course, the FCT. And I'll see you soon.